The hum of a heavy, bulletproof window descending to reveal the sharp, obsidian eyes of a man who commands an empire, staring at a woman who just used his vehicle to adjust her ponytail. The story follows Shun, a vibrant black urban designer, and Lu Lee, a feared Korean millionaire with a cold heart, hardened by the criminal underworld. Their worlds collide in a rain-slicked metropolis when Shun, rushing to a career-defining presentation, uses the pitch-black window of Lu Lee's armored limousine as a mirror. Instead of the expected intimidation, Lu Lee is captivated by her unbothered grace. Their connection deepens when Shun is contracted to redesign one of Lu Lee's luxury estates. As professional friction turns to vulnerability, Shun discovers the burden of Lu Lee's past and his father's sacrifices. After a brief attempt to push her away for her safety, Lu Lee realizes that love is not an inefficiency, but the ultimate power, leaving his heart irrevocably hers. The armored glass of the black limousine descended with the heavy, mechanical hum of absolute power. Shun's world fractured as the dark tint dissolved to reveal a man who looked less like a passenger and more like a king in a cage. She froze, her fingers still tangled in her thick curls, her hand halfway through adjusting a golden hair accessory she'd been using the window to position. "Do you always use bulletproof glass as a vanity mirror?" the man asked. His voice was a low, dangerous velvet that sent a shiver straight down her spine. Shun jumped back so abruptly her heels nearly slipped on the rain-slicked pavement. Her designer portfolio swung wildly at her side, almost spilling the blueprints she'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. Heat flooded her cheeks, a deep crimson that burned against her dark skin as she stared at the man inside the vehicle. He had a jawline that could cut glass and eyes like polished obsidian, eyes that suggested he'd never been surprised by anything in his life until this moment. "Oh my God," the words tumbled out in a breathless rush. I didn't see. The windows were so dark. I'm so sorry." Lu Lee should have been irritated. In his world, people didn't touch his things, and they certainly didn't lean against his armored transport to fix their hair. His security detail was likely already reaching for their holsters, wondering who this vibrant woman was who dared to treat his mobile fortress like a powder room. But as he watched her face cycle through a dizzying array of emotions, sharp embarrassment, a flash of indignation at being caught, and then a flicker of genuine amusement at the absurdity of it all, his mouth did something it rarely did. It twitched. He didn't believe in destiny or meaningful coincidences. He believed in logistics, power, and the cold reality of the streets. But this woman, with her bright clothes and her unguarded expression, had done the impossible in under 30 seconds. She'd made him feel a spark of curiosity that had nothing to do with business. Shun straightened her spine, trying to reclaim some shred of her professional dignity. "I have a presentation in 10 minutes, she said, her voice regaining its melodic strength. "My hair was a mess from the wind, and your car was conveniently placed." Lu Lee leaned back into the shadows of the plush leather interior, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're late," he remarked, nodding toward the portfolio clutched against her hip. "I am aware," she countered, her lips twitching into a defiant, beautiful smile that could have powered the entire city. "Are you going to have your security arrest me for mirror theft, or can I go save my career?" The corner of Lu Lee's mouth lifted into a rare, barely visible smirk. It was a short, surprised expression, rusty from disuse, but it was real. It transformed his face from a mask of stone into something devastatingly human. "Go," he said quietly, "and try not to be late for the people who actually matter." Shun laughed, a bright, warm sound that seemed to cut through the gray city smog. "Thanks for the reflection. Nice car, by the way." "I know," he replied. She turned and began to jog toward the glass towers of the financial district, her movements full of a grace she wasn't even aware of. Lu Lee sat in the silence of his car for 3 full minutes after she disappeared, staring at the empty space on the sidewalk where she had stood. His phone buzzed with an incoming message about a territory dispute, but for the first time in 31 years, his mind was elsewhere. He found himself thinking of dark skin, a bright smile, and the way she'd looked at him without an ounce of the intimidation he usually commanded. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It didn't matter. He'd likely never see her again. Shun spent the next 48 hours in a blur of adrenaline and charcoal sketches. The encounter with the man in the limousine had become a vivid, flickering ghost in the back of her mind. A splash of obsidian eyes and a rare smirk that she used to fuel her creative fire. She had nailed her presentation, and now, her firm had been summoned to the penthouse of the Lee Corporation to finalize the contract for the most ambitious urban restoration project in the city's history. This was the moment that would transition her from a talented artist to a household name. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, the air heavy with the scent of expensive filtration and cold success. Shun smoothed her skirt, checked her hair one last time, using her phone's front-facing camera this time, safely away from any car windows, and stepped out into a lobby made of white marble and silence. Her boss, Marcus, was already sweating, his briefcase clutched tight. This client doesn't do second chances, Shun. If the principal doesn't like the aesthetic, we're out before the ink is dry. Just be brilliant. She nodded, her heart hammering a rhythmic beat against her ribs. They were ushered into a boardroom that felt more like a command center. A massive table of reclaimed ebony stretched across the room, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city she dreamed of redesigning. 3 men in sharp, identical suits stood at attention, but it was the figure seated at the head of the table, his back to the door, that commanded the oxygen in the room. "Mr. Lee," Marcus began, his voice uncharacteristically high. "We have the preliminary designs for the estate. My lead designer, Shun, has developed a vision that blends the heritage of the district with modern luxury." The high-backed leather chair swiveled slowly. Shun's breath hitched in her throat, the air leaving her lungs as if she'd been struck. It was him. The sharp jawline, the impeccable tailoring, and those eyes, polished obsidian, now fixed on her with a piercing intensity. Lu Lee didn't look like a man who spent his mornings being a convenient mirror. Here, in his element, he looked like a predator who had just found something far more interesting than quarterly projections. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thick and suffocating. Marcus looked between his designer and the billionaire, his brow furrowing in confusion. Shun felt the familiar heat rising to her cheeks, but she forced herself to stand tall. She wouldn't let the embarrassment of the sidewalk steal her professional poise. "So," Lu Lee said, his voice that same low, dangerous velvet she remembered. He didn't look at the blueprints. He looked only at her. "The mirror thief is an urban designer." Marcus choked on his own breath. I'm sorry. Mirror thief." Shun didn't look at her boss. She kept her gaze locked on Lu Lee's, her chin lifting in a silent challenge. "And the man who doesn't call the police is a real estate mogul," she countered softly. "I suppose we're both full of surprises today, Mr. Lee." One of the aides moved to speak, likely to reprimand her for the lack of deference, but Lu Lee held up a single, gloved hand. The room fell instantly still. A flicker of that rare, rusty amusement crossed his face, gone as quickly as a lightning strike, but Shun saw it. She felt the electricity of it jump across the table, a tether connecting her vibrant world to his shadowed one. "Sit," Lu Lee commanded, gesturing to the chair directly opposite his. "Show me if your talent is as bold as your tongue, Miss Shun. I have high expectations for my estates. I don't invest in things that are merely convenient." Shun sat, opening her portfolio with steady hands. As she spread the vibrant, gold-flecked sketches across the ebony table, she could feel his eyes on her, not just on her work, but on the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she refused to be intimidated by the cold power he radiated. She realized then that this wasn't just a contract. This was a collision. And as Lu Lee leaned forward to inspect a rendering of a garden courtyard, his shoulder brushing near hers, Shun knew that the frozen heart of the city's most dangerous man had just found its first crack. The following weeks transformed the sprawling, skeletal remains of the Lee estate into a battlefield of vision and willpower. The site was a fortress of gray concrete and steel, crawling with silent security teams and elite contractors who spoke only in hushed tones. Into this sterile, disciplined world, Shun arrived like a solar flare. She carried with her rolls of gold-leafed vellum, samples of vibrant West African textiles she intended to weave into the modernist architecture, and a portable speaker that softly hummed with the soulful rhythm of high-life music. Lu Lee found himself visiting the site with increasing and entirely unnecessary frequency. He told his associates it was to oversee the structural integrity of the West Wing, but in truth, he was there to observe the anomaly that was Shun. He watched her from the shadows of a mezzanine as she stood in the center of the unfinished ballroom. The morning sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the amber highlights in her hair as she gestured wildly to a group of stonemasons. She wasn't just giving orders, she was telling a story. She laughed at something a foreman said, a bright, uninhibited sound that echoed off the cold marble walls, making the entire room feel less like a monument to wealth and more like a home. Lu Lee stepped out of the shadows, his presence cooling the air instantly. The workmen stiffened, their spines straightening in a reflexive display of deference. But Shun simply turned, her eyes lighting up with a spark that wasn't fear. "You're hovering again, Mr. Lee," she called out, a playful tilt to her head. "Are you checking the foundation, or did you just come to see the gold leaf?" "I am ensuring my investment doesn't become a gallery for your personal eccentricities," Lu countered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He walked toward her, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone. "Eccentricity is just another word for soul," Shun said, stepping closer to him. She smelled of sandalwood and the outdoors, a sharp contrast to the metallic, sterile scent of his daily life. She held up a tile sample, a deep, iridescent gold that seemed to trap the light. "Look at this. When the sun hits the foyer at 4 o'clock, it's going to look like the house is breathing. It won't just be a building, it'll be alive." Lu looked at the tile, then at her. He was mesmerized, not by the material, but by the unguarded joy that radiated from her. In his world, joy was a liability, a crack in the armor that enemies could exploit. He had spent 31 years perfecting a life of obsidian-hard control, surrounded by people who only smiled when they wanted something. Yet here was Shun, finding genuine delight in the way light hit a piece of ceramic, completely unbothered by the fact that she was speaking to a man who could dismantle her career with a phone call. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could filter it. "Why pour so much of yourself into stone and mortar?" Shun paused, her expression softening into something more thoughtful. "Because life is too short for gray walls, Lu. People think they want a fortress, but what they actually need is a place that reminds them they're human. Don't you ever get tired of the concrete?" For a moment, the heavy silence of the estate felt oppressive. Lu looked around at his masterpiece of security and status, and for the first time, it looked empty. He looked back at Shun, who was now leaning against a pillar, watching him with those warm, observant eyes. "I have lived in the concrete my entire life," he admitted, his voice a low whisper. "Then it's a good thing I'm here," she said, her smile returning, softer this time. She reached out, her fingers briefly brushing the sleeve of his expensive wool coat as she pointed toward the garden. "Wait until you see what I've planned for the courtyard. We're going to plant things that only bloom at night. It'll be our little secret." The word "our" hung in the air, a golden thread pulling him toward her. Lu Lee, the man of obsidian and iron, felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom behind his ribs. He should have walked away. He should have reminded her of the professional boundaries. Instead, he simply stood there in the dust and the sunlight, watching her move back toward her blueprints, realizing that his sterile empire was no longer enough. The sky over the city had turned a bruised purple, weeping a steady, rhythmic rain that blurred the neon lights into streaks of neon gold and electric blue. Shun stood under the awning of a discreet, high-end bistro tucked away from the main thoroughfare, shaking out her umbrella. She had expected a working dinner in a boardroom, but Lu Lee had sent a car to bring her here, a place where the walls were lined with old books instead of monitors, and the air smelled of cedar and rich, dark coffee. When she was led to a secluded booth in the back, she found Lu already waiting. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that bore the faint, jagged reminders of a life lived in the trenches of the city's hierarchy. The harsh light of the office was gone, replaced by the flickering warmth of a single candle between them. "You look different without a hard hat and a roll of blueprints," Lu said, his voice dropping an octave in the quiet space. "And you look almost human without a desk between us," Shun countered, sliding into the velvet seat. She watched him pour a glass of deep red wine, his movements precise, yet unusually heavy. "Is this still about the West Wing masonry, or did you realize you actually need to eat?" Lu was silent for a moment, watching the rain lash against the window beside them. "My mother used to say that rain was the city's way of washing away the secrets it couldn't carry anymore. In Seoul, when I was very small, we lived in a room that felt smaller than this booth. When it rained, the sound on the corrugated roof was so loud we couldn't hear each other speak." Shun stilled, her glass halfway to her lips. It was the first time he had volunteered a piece of himself that didn't involve a transaction or a command. "I didn't picture you in a small room, Lu." "No one does now," he said, a ghost of a bitter smile touching his lips. "But the concrete I told you about, the fortress I built, it started there. My father worked 3 jobs, his hands always stained with oil and grease, just so I could stand in a room like this one day. He died before he could see the first building I bought. He left me with an empire of debt and a name that meant nothing. I had to turn that name into a shield. I had to become the man who never gets surprised, because being surprised in my world means being dead." The vulnerability in his voice was like a physical weight in the air. Shun reached across the table, her hand hovering for a second before she gently rested her fingers over his. His skin was cool, but his pulse was fast, thrumming against the pads of her fingers. "You've spent so much time honoring his sacrifice by building walls," she whispered, her eyes locked on his obsidian gaze. "But did he want you to be a fortress, or did he want you to be happy?" Lu didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. The contrast was startling, her warmth against his guarded chill, the gold of her rings catching the candlelight. The professional mask he had worn for decades didn't just slip, it shattered. For the first time, the feared millionaire looked like a man who was tired of being alone in the dark. "I don't know how to do both," he admitted, his thumb tracing the curve of her palm. "I look at you, and I see a world that isn't made of shadows and steel. It terrifies me, Shun. You are the only thing in this city I haven't been able to calculate." "Good," she said softly, a small, encouraging smile lighting up her face. "Calculations are boring. Try feeling the rain instead of just listening to it." They sat in the quiet of the bistro for hours, the dinner forgotten as the rain turned the world outside into a watercolor painting. In that small, candlelit corner, the mafia boss and the designer weren't client and contractor. They were two souls finally speaking the same language, oblivious to the fact that the shadows Lu Lee lived in were already beginning to stir, threatened by the light he was letting in. The golden warmth of the bistro felt like a distant dream the moment they stepped back out into the rain. The transition was jarring. The quiet intimacy of their dinner was instantly swallowed by the cold, mechanical efficiency of Lu Lee's reality. 2 black SUVs had appeared at the curb, their engines idling with a low, predatory growl that seemed to vibrate through the pavement. Shun noticed the shift in Lu immediately. The man who had just admitted to feeling terrified of her was gone, replaced by the stoic commander who lived in the concrete. His hand, which had been laced through hers moments ago, now moved to the small of her back, guiding her with a sudden, sharp urgency toward the waiting car. "Lu, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tight with the first real flare of anxiety. Before he could answer, a shadow detached itself from the mouth of a nearby alley. A man in a heavy coat approached, his gait hurried and his eyes darting toward the street corners. He didn't look like a businessman or an architect. He looked like a soldier in a war Shun didn't know was being fought. He leaned in, whispering a few frantic words in Korean to Lu. The air around Lu Lee turned to ice. His jaw tightened so hard a small muscle pulsed in his cheek. He didn't look at the man. He looked over Shun's head, scanning the rooftops and the darkened windows of the surrounding buildings with the calculated precision of a man who knew exactly where a threat would come from. "Get in the car, Shun." Now he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order backed by years of absolute authority. "Not until you tell me what's happening," she countered, her heels digging into the wet sidewalk. She wasn't a soldier, and she wasn't his employee. She was a woman who had just seen his soul, and she refused to be shoved back into the dark. Lu turned to her, his obsidian eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and a raw, protective instinct. "This is the shadow I told you about. The cost of the name I built. My father didn't just leave me dead, Shun. He left me a legacy of blood and rivals who believe that if they can't break my empire, they can break the things I care about." The weight of his words hit her harder than the cold rain. For the first time, Shun glimpsed the true burden he carried. It wasn't just about wealth or status. It was a relentless, exhausting vigilance. He wasn't just building estates. He was maintaining a fortress to keep the ghosts of his father's past from consuming his future. Every brick she laid in his house was a target. Every hour he spent with her was a vulnerability. "Is this why you're always so cold?" she whispered, the realization dawning on her. "Because if you stop watching, everything falls apart." "Everything," he confirmed, his voice barely audible over the hum of the idling engines. "My father died trying to protect a single room in Seoul. I have spent every day since then making sure I never lose a single inch of what I've built in his honor. But the more I build, the more there is to guard." A sudden screech of tires echoed from the next block over, and the men by the SUVs moved with practiced, lethal speed, forming a human shield around them. Lu didn't hesitate this time. He swung the heavy, armored door open and practically bundled her into the back seat, sliding in right beside her. As the car lurched forward, weaving through the rain-slicked traffic with aggressive precision, Shun looked at Lu. He was staring out the tinted window, his profile etched in the fleeting light of the street lamps. He looked powerful, untouchable, and utterly alone. She reached out, taking his hand again. It was cold, clutched in a tight fist, but as her fingers touched his, he didn't pull away. He didn't look at her, but his grip tightened around her hand, a silent acknowledgement that the shadows were closing in, and the light she brought into his life was becoming the most dangerous thing he owned. The following afternoon, the estate was strangely quiet, the usual hum of power tools replaced by the soft patter of a light mist against the newly installed glass. Shun was in the sun-drenched kitchen, comparing marble swatches, when the heavy oak doors creaked open. It wasn't Lu Lee who entered, but a woman who carried his same regal posture, though her eyes held a warmth that his had long since abandoned. Mrs. Park moved with a quiet elegance, her presence commanding the room without a single word. She was carrying a small, silk-wrapped container that filled the air with the sharp, fermented scent of home. "You are the girl from the window," the older woman said, her voice a gentle rasp that felt like worn velvet. It wasn't a question. Shun stood, feeling a sudden, uncharacteristic wave of nerves. I'm Shun. I'm the designer," Mrs. Park finished, setting the container on the island. "And the mirror thief. My son does not talk about many things, but he talks about you with his eyes." She gestured for Shun to sit, and for a moment, the high-stakes world of the Lee Empire faded away. Mrs. Park began to unpack the containers, homemade kimchi and rice, arranging them with the same precision Lu applied to his blueprints. "Lu is a difficult man," Mrs. Park said, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the food. "He has spent 31 years hiding his heart in a place where he thinks no one can find it. When we came here, he saw his father break. He saw that to be soft was to be crushed. So, he decided to become the stone." Shun watched the older woman's hands, seeing the faint tremors of age and the strength of a woman who had survived the same shadows Lu now commanded. "He told me about the room in Seoul. About the rain." Mrs. Park nodded slowly. "He thinks he is protecting us by being a fortress. He thinks that if he lets anyone in, the walls will crumble and the shadows will win. When he was a boy, he had a small dog, a scruffy thing he found in an alley. He loved it more than his own life. When that dog died, Lu didn't cry. He just buried his toys and never asked for another living thing again. He decided then that loss was a price he wouldn't pay twice. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades of guarded silence. Shun thought of the man in the bistro, the way his fingers had trembled slightly when they touched hers, and the way he had bundled her into the car the night before. He wasn't just being a boss or a protector. He was a man terrified of the very joy she represented. He thinks love is a weakness, Shun whispered. He thinks love is a target, Mrs. Park corrected, her eyes meeting Shun's with a piercing intensity. He has spent 31 years achieving, but he has forgotten how to live. You are the first person to make him look at the light instead of the exit. But be careful, child. A man who has been in the dark that long. The sun can be very painful at first. Mrs. Park reached across the table, patting Shun's hand with a touch that was surprisingly firm. He will try to push you away. He will tell you that you are a distraction or a danger. When he does, remember the boy with the dog. He is not protecting himself from you. He is protecting himself from the person he becomes when he is with you. As Mrs. Park rose to leave, the kitchen felt colder, the shadows in the corners of the estate seeming to stretch longer. Shun looked down at the simple meal left behind, realizing that she wasn't just designing a house anymore. She was trying to build a home for a man who had spent his entire life convinced he didn't deserve one. And according to his mother, the hardest part of the project was just beginning. The following week, the atmosphere at the estate didn't just cool, it froze. The light, night-blooming jasmine Shun had carefully selected for the courtyard arrived in crates, but Lu Lee was nowhere to be found to witness the transformation. When he finally appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, he wasn't the man from the rain-slicked bistro or the son who listened to his mother's stories. He was back in the charcoal suit that looked like armor, surrounded by 3 men whose hands never strayed far from their waistbands. Shun was on a ladder, marking the placement for a series of gold-leafed sconces, when she felt the shift in the room. She climbed down, wiping a smudge of plaster from her cheek, her face automatically lighting up with the unguarded joy that had become his undoing. "Lu, you have to see the foyer," she started, her voice warm and melodic. "The way the 3 o'clock light hits the marble, it's exactly what we talked about. It feels alive." Lu Lee didn't step into the light. He stayed in the shadow of the vaulted archway, his expression as flat and unreadable as a sheet of slate. He didn't look at the foyer, and for the first time since the boardroom, he wouldn't look at her. "The masonry in the West Wing is behind schedule," he said, his voice stripped of the velvet warmth he'd shared over the candlelight. It was the voice of a man conducting a hostile takeover. "And I've reviewed the invoices for the textiles. They are an unnecessary expenditure." Shun stopped, the smile dying on her lips. The transition was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "The textiles were your favorite part, Lu. You said they gave the room soul." "What is this?" "This is a construction site, Miss Shun," he replied, using her formal title like a weapon. "And I am a client who is losing his patience with soul. I've allowed this project to become sentimental. That was my mistake." He finally turned his gaze to her, but the obsidian eyes were cold, devoid of the spark she had spent weeks coaxing to the surface. He looked at her not as the woman who had stolen his heart through a car window, but as a line item in a ledger he was ready to close. "Lu, stop," she said, stepping toward him, her hand reaching out. "I know what happened the other night. I know the pressure you're under with the shadows, but you don't have to do this. You don't have to go back into the concrete." He flinched as if her words were a physical threat. The fear his mother had described, the terror of the boy with the dog, flashed behind his eyes for a split second before the ice refortified. He took a step back, widening the distance between them. "The other night was a lapse in judgment," he said, his voice rising with a harsh, defensive edge. "I was tired, and the rain makes everyone imagine things that aren't there. You are a talented designer, and I hired you to do a specific task. But let's be very clear about our reality. You are a contractor. This is just a job. Once the last stone is laid, our association ends." The words felt like a serrated blade. Shun felt the heat of embarrassment rising, but this time it wasn't the playful flush of the rodeo drive sidewalk. It was the burn of a woman who had offered her heart to a man who was now using it for target practice. "A job?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Is that all I am? A proximity mistake. You are a distraction I can no longer afford," Lu said, his eyes finally meeting hers with a cruelty that was too polished to be anything but a lie. "My life does not have room for night-blooming jasmine or songs in the kitchen. It has room for results. Finish the estate, send the final bill to my assistant, and don't be on the premises when I move in." He turned on his heel, his security detail falling into step behind him like a wall of shadow. Shun stood in the center of the ballroom she had designed to be full of light, watching him walk away. The silence of the estate returned, heavier than before, and as the 3 o'clock sun hit the gold leaf on the walls, it didn't look like the house was breathing anymore. It just looked like an expensive, beautiful tomb. The rain had returned, a relentless gray curtain that blurred the city's sharp edges, but inside Shun's small, light-filled studio, the atmosphere was even heavier. She was staring at a half-finished watercolor of the estate's courtyard when a sharp, insistent knock echoed through the room. Expecting a courier or perhaps her boss with more bad news about the Lee contract, she opened the door, only to find Mrs. Park standing there. The older woman was draped in a dark trench coat, her face a mask of quiet, formidable determination. "Mrs. Park? I'm not supposed to be working on the project anymore," Shun said, her voice catching as she tried to maintain her composure. "I am not here for the project," Mrs. Park said, stepping into the room with the grace of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. She placed a heavy, ceramic jar of tea on Shun's drafting table. "I am here because my son is a brilliant man who has become a coward." Shun flinched at the word. "He was very clear, Mrs. Park. He said I was a distraction. A mistake. He said those things because he is terrified," Mrs. Park countered, her eyes softening as she looked at the sketches pinned to the walls. "When the dog died, the one I told you about, Lu did not just bury the toys. He tried to bury the boy who loved them. He thinks that if he stays in the dark, nothing can be taken from him. But a man who has nothing to lose has nothing to live for. He has built a palace of glass, and he is sitting inside it, freezing to death because he is afraid of the sun." While Shun struggled with the weight of the mother's words, a few miles away, Lu Lee was sitting in his sprawling, empty office. The quarterly projections were perfect, his rivals were in retreat, and the estate was nearing completion. By every metric of his world, he was winning. Yet, as he stared at his reflection in the darkened window, the same kind of window where he had first seen a woman with gold-flecked eyes fixing her hair, he felt a hollow ache that no amount of power could fill. The door to his office swung open without a page's announcement. Mrs. Park walked in, followed closely by Lu's oldest advisor, a man who had served his father. "Mother, I am in the middle of a—" "You are in the middle of a grave," Mrs. Park interrupted, her voice cracking the sterile silence of the room. She walked to his desk and slammed a small, weathered photograph down onto the mahogany surface. It was the only picture of Lu as a child, smiling, holding that scruffy dog in the cramped room in Seoul. "You think you honor your father by living like a machine," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and grief. "But your father worked those 3 jobs so you could have the heart he didn't have the time to use. He didn't want a fortress, Lu. He wanted a son who was brave enough to be happy. Pushing that girl away isn't strength. It is the greatest act of cowardice you have ever committed." Lu looked at the photo, then at his mother. The obsidian mask flickered. "She is a target, Mother. My world is dangerous." "The world is always dangerous," his advisor added quietly from the doorway. "But your father died with a smile because he loved us. You are living with a scowl because you are afraid to. If you let her go, you aren't protecting her. You are just ensuring that when the shadows finally come for you, you'll be facing them alone." Lu Lee looked back at the window. He saw the city lights, the rain, and the vast, cold empire he had built. For 31 years, he had believed that love was an inefficiency, a flaw in the engineering of a successful life. But as his mother's words settled into the cracks of his frozen heart, he realized the truth. He wasn't afraid of his enemies. He was afraid of the joy he saw in Shun's reflection, the joy that whispered that his life, for all its wealth, had been empty. "Go," Mrs. Park commanded, her voice softening. "Before the concrete sets, and you become part of the wall." Lu didn't answer. He didn't need to. He grabbed his coat, the obsidian in his eyes finally catching a spark of something that wasn't calculation. It was the same look he'd had at 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. The look of a man who finally wanted to believe in something impossible. The rain was still falling, but the atmosphere in Shun's studio had shifted from a heavy silence to a frantic, creative hum. She wasn't working on the estate anymore. She was painting for herself, splashing vibrant ochre and deep indigo onto a canvas to drown out the memory of Lu Lee's cold dismissal. She didn't hear the car pull up, nor the heavy door of the studio creak open. It wasn't until the scent of rain and expensive sandalwood filled the small room that she turned around. Lu Lee stood in the doorway, drenched. His charcoal coat was ruined, his hair was plastered to his forehead, and his chest was heaving as if he had run the entire way from his skyscraper. The obsidian mask was gone. In its place was a raw, naked vulnerability that made him look younger and, for the first time, truly alive. "Shun," he breathed, the name sounding like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. Shun didn't move. She held her paintbrush like a shield. "The bill is in the mail, Lu. You were very clear about our association ending." "I was a coward," he said, stepping into the room, leaving a trail of rainwater on her hardwood floors. "I told you I've lived in the concrete my whole life. What I didn't tell you is that I was comfortable there. It was safe. It didn't require me to feel the weight of what my father lost." He took another step, his eyes never leaving hers. "But a life without you isn't safe. It's just empty. I spent 31 years achieving everything, only to realize I have nothing if I can't see it through your eyes." Shun's grip on the brush loosened. "You said I was a distraction." "You are," he countered, a ghost of that rare, beautiful smirk touching his lips. "You're a distraction from the shadows. You're the reason I don't want to look at the exit anymore." My mother was right. I was trying to protect myself from the person I become when I'm with you, because that person is capable of being hurt. But I'd rather be hurt by you than protected by a wall of stone. He reached her then, his hands trembling as he reached out to cup her face. His skin was cold from the rain, but his touch was frantic and warm. "I don't know how to do this perfectly. I don't know how to stop the shadows from coming. But I know that love isn't an inefficiency. It's the only thing that makes the empire worth building." Shun looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy with the dog, the man with the burdened heart, and the partner who was finally brave enough to be happy. She dropped the brush and reached up, her fingers tangling in his damp hair, pulling him down to her. When they kissed, it wasn't like the polite, calculated world Lu had come from. It was like the night-blooming jasmine, sudden, fragrant, and defiant of the dark. The frozen heart of Lu Lee didn't just thaw. It melted into the vibrant, gold-flecked world Shun had created. "I'm still going to paint your foyer gold," she whispered against his lips. "Paint the whole world gold if you want," he replied, his voice a low, steady vow. "As long as you're standing in the middle of it." The rain continued to lash against the windows of the studio, but inside, the shadows had finally retreated. Park Lu Lee, the man who believed in nothing but logistics and power, finally understood the truth his father had tried to leave him. Love wasn't a liability. Love was everything. And as he held her in the quiet light of the studio, his heart, once cold, once closed, once convinced it was safer alone, beat warm and open, completely and irrevocably hers.